Hello, everyone. This video is going to be a walkthrough of how to read the ICD-10-CM guidelines. This is the very basis of all of our coding, so it's really important that you understand this part of coding before we get any further into the semester or into the codes themselves, okay? So what is the purpose of the guidelines? The guidelines are really just a roadmap for using the codes. Kind of look at it as a Rosetta Stone. It's something that helps us translate all these thousands of codes into something meaningful and useful for us. It gives us the rules, the processes, and how to just accurately apply the codes for specific diagnoses or just specific situations. When you take the national exam, you'll see the CPC exam is all about the guidelines. It says that on the AAPC website. Basically, that means if you know how to use the guidelines, you know how to code, and you can do it quickly and effectively. So it's really important that we use this as a foundation for all of our coding moving forward. I don't want anyone to think like the guidelines are arbitrary. It's something that doesn't matter. It's just another set of rules. No, this is the thing, the document that makes the rest of the manual usable. So it's very, very important that we focus heavily on using the guidelines and we reference them often. This is not something you learn once. This is something we continually reference, okay? But it is important to know how to read them. Occasionally, you will be given a reference, be told to reference this specific guideline. And it's important you know how to find what's being referenced. So if you've ever made an outline, maybe for a history class or written a story and not needed to make a very detailed outline for it, it follows that same format. So we're going to go from most specific or most general to most specific. Okay, so we're going to start with the very, very general section and get all the way down to sometimes parenthetical Roman numerals of specificity, very, very specific coding guidelines for a certain situation. Okay, so for example, if I gave you the guideline 1C1 A2A, that's going to tell you that you're going to look in section 1, which is one of the biggest section. It's going to be conventions, general coding guidelines, chapter specific guidelines. It's a really big section in your guidelines. Then that goes to letter C, which is the chapter specific guidelines. So we have kind of general guidelines and then we have chapter specific guidelines. Then we get into letter A, which is the guidelines for HIV infections. And then more specific than that is sequencing HIV codes. And then even more specific than that is the parenthetical letter A, which is how to code patients admitted for HIV-related conditions. So it's very, very specific. We go all the way from really general down to super, super specific situations, okay? So if all that is Greek to you, that's totally fine. But I do want you to try it out and see if you can find it. So please flip to your guidelines if you know where they are, and see if you can find this specific guideline. Now, in order to find this, you will likely need to have the 2022 ICD-10. If you don't, you might not be able to find this. But otherwise, I'd like you to pause the video, go see if you can find this, and then we'll see if you got it correct. Now, if you found acute respiratory distress syndrome, then you have found the correct code, right? Now, this is a syndrome that is specific to COVID-19. Obviously, we didn't have this guideline even a couple years ago. So this is a brand new guideline. And it goes from very, very general, right? Section 1, all the way down to very, very specific, which is this parenthetical Roman numeral 4. So as you can see, we get all kinds of different guidelines. They get super, super specific and they change frequently. So that's why it's important that we see this as kind of a more living document that can be adjusted, and we always need to be referencing to make sure we're doing things correctly. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go look at the general coding guidelines, and I'm going to go through a few of them. They are really the guidelines that have applications across all the different chapters. Everything we're looking at this semester, you're going to be using the general coding guidelines. But I'm not going to be able to get through all of them in this video. I'm going to look at a few very specific situations, but we do go through it more in your textbook And then in the other PowerPoint that's attached for this module, we get into more specific situations, and I'll probably do some additional videos on some of the other guidelines that are in there. But I'm just going to go through a few so we kind of get a feel for it. Okay. I would really recommend that you put a tab here at the general coding guidelines, and that you mark this section up a lot, because it is really, really vital to how we code the rest of the semester. Okay. So if you're still feeling anxious about writing in your book, now's the time to tackle that anxiety and go ahead and start writing and highlighting in your book. Okay. All right. So I'm going to switch to the document camera. Okay. As you can see, I have my 2022 manual. I always say what manual it is. Maybe that gets annoying, but that's because one time last year, I made a whole video not realizing because I had already had it open to the section I was going to work in, and I didn't check the front, and I was using the previous year's manual, and codes change every year. So one of the codes was incorrect. So that's why I always start now with the front cover to make sure I'm checking, you're checking, always make sure you're using the right manual. Okay, so we are going to go to the guidelines section. We already put a tab there, right up here. But if you haven't put a tab yet, one, go ahead and do it. Two, it's here in this red section. Okay, it starts on page 1. And there is an introduction here. Now, I think with a lot of different courses, especially if you're taking like kind of a general education course, you'll have that first week, that first chapter, that's history, background, and it kind of feels like it's throwaway information. It's good, but you're not really going to use it, right? That is not the case here. I can tell you from personal experience, I had a question on the national exam that I was able to answer only using this page. And I was just lucky that I was flipping through and I saw the answer here. This gives you some really good background information. And Joe published the ICD. What else does it have in here? It talks about that the CMS facilitates this, talks about the term encounter. I can tell you for sure that was one of the questions on my national exam. What kind of settings was the term encounter used for? All settings. Okay. It talks about HIPAA, it talks about really good information. So I would read through this. This is not a throwaway introductory, we just need to add an extra page here. Nope, this is really good information. So I would read through that. On page 2, we get into kind of a table of contents for the whole guidelines document. And this can be helpful and it might not be too helpful. It just kind of depends. But for what it's worth, you can see we have section 1, and then it's going to list what's in each section. And when it goes through letter A, B, C, and so on and so forth. And then we get into, tells us what's in section 2, section 3, section 4, and then the appendix. We are looking in section 1. And if you look at the very first letter, which is letter A, in here is everything we actually already covered in this course. So if you haven't looked at this already, it might be helpful for you to see how the actual guidelines present the information we've already talked about. Things like excludes 1, excludes 2, NEC, NOS, and what those mean. And includes notes, unspecified codes, all of that kind of stuff is already in here. So if you found yourself maybe not 100% understanding previous videos and things like that, this might be really helpful for you. So I would definitely recommend looking through it, at least skimming it, and making sure you know what's in here and that you can reference it if you're not understanding, or if you forget. Oftentimes I forget, especially with the excludes notes. I forget this often. What is the difference, right? It can get really tricky. And the key for excludes 1 and excludes 2, you can already see I've highlighted here, is not coded here and not included here. So those are the difference. And so that's really helpful when you're actually, if you forget, just get confused, you can just double check and be confident there. But we are looking for letter B. And that's on page 7. And this is going to be all of the general coding guidelines. Okay, so this whole section, and there's a lot in here. We're not going to get into all of it. I'm just going to get into a few of the first ones, and I'll do additional videos for more situations as we go. But these are all the guidelines that are going to apply across all of your coding, regardless of what chapter you're working in. So even if you're talking about burns, or you're talking about HIV, or you're talking about a vaccination visit, these kinds of things are going to apply. Okay. So the very first thing we're going to look at is 1B1, okay? So we're already in section 1, we already know, as we started here, section 1, that's the conventions, general coding guidelines, chapter specific guidelines. And we are looking at letter B, which is general coding guidelines, okay? Then we're looking at number 1, which is locating a code in the ICD-10. So I would recommend reading through this because it gives you a very concise but clear explanation of what we do when we're coding. We start in the alpha that references us to the tabular. When we go to the tabular, we then check all of the conventions and make sure we're selecting the most specific best code that we can. So I would make a note about it. You know, you can see I've already written notes here. If you want to make a note somewhere else in your manual, that's fine too. But I think it's good just to put a note here that this is telling you need to do alpha, then the tabular. Okay. And so that's what this guideline is about. Then we're going to look at 1B2. And that's, remember, we're already in section 1, letter B, number 2. So it's going to be level of detail in coding. And this is helpful because it's explaining to us that regardless of the codes that are in there, we want to select the code that gives the highest level of specificity. So 7 characters is the maximum number of characters that you could use. If 7 characters is available for a specific condition, we want to use 7 characters. That's what this is telling us, okay? It also says a 3-character code is to be used only if it is not further subdivided. So what does that mean? Let's flip to a code right now. And we can check. So let's see here. Okay, so here's G6. It doesn't have to be this code. It could be any code. But as you can see, G06 is a 3-character code, okay? We can't use that. Why? Because this code is further subdivided. There are more specific codes available, all right? So we can not use this code. We already would know that because we have a red stop sign here. But if we didn't know that, or we didn't have that red stop sign, we would know we can't use this code anyway because our guideline tells us we need to use the most specific code available, and we should not use a 3-character code if it is subdivided into further sections, okay? Now, if you look down here at G08, this section is not subdivided into other sections. So we could use this code. We could use a 3-character code because it is not subdivided into other sections. Now, it looks like there is significant guidance here, lots of excludes notes. So we'd have to be really careful before we use this 3-character code, but we could technically use it because it is not further subdivided, provided it was in the appropriate circumstance, okay? But if we had a 3-character code that is subdivided, we can't use a 3-character code, okay? So that's all that guideline is telling us. That's what's going there. And then I'm not going to get into 3 because that's saying we just need to select a code from one of these sections. But let's go to 1B4. So we already know we're in section 1, letter B, number 4. And if you can read it here. Okay. So it says signs and symptoms. And this tells us that codes that describe signs and symptoms as opposed to diagnoses are acceptable for reporting purposes when a related definitive diagnosis has not been established by the provider. So what does that mean? That means that, let's go ahead and try a certain circumstance. So say you showed up to the doctor and you had fever, congestion, and loss of smell. And for whatever reason, your doctor cannot confirm that you have COVID. You could code all of these conditions instead. That's what this is saying. So when we do not have a definitive diagnosis, we can go ahead and code these things, okay? So we put a code for fever, a code for congestion, a code for loss of smell, all right? So that is what this section is telling us. If we don't have a definitive diagnosis, but we have symptoms, we can go ahead and code those symptoms, all right? So let's look at the next one. So we have 1B5. So remember, we're already in section 1. Letter B, number 5. And this is going to be kind of hard to read because it's all the way down here at the bottom. So I would recommend you're following along with me. It says signs and symptoms that are associated routinely with disease process should not be assigned additional codes with otherwise instructed by the classification. So what does that mean? Let's go back to our scenario here. So let's say, here we go. All right, so let's say we go to the doctor, we have fever, congestion, loss of smell, and we tested positive for COVID-19. So yes, we finally got that swab in there. We have COVID-19 positive. So since we are testing positive for that, we would not be coding these symptoms, okay? That's what that means. That means we would code the COVID-19, and all of these things are related to the condition, so we would not provide codes for each of those. Instead, we would just code COVID-19. We already know fever is a part of COVID-19, congestion is part of COVID-19, loss of smell is part of COVID-19. This is why I had you get the medical dictionary, because not everything is going to be this clear cut. You might not know the condition. It might be something totally, maybe it's Raynaud's disease and you don't know what that is. So you don't know if the symptoms are related to that condition or not. You can do a little research and figure it out, okay? But the more familiar you are with conditions that you're coding, the better you're going to be able to determine what's related to that condition or not. So this specific guideline is telling us that if this is integral to the disease, it's something that is commonly associated with the disease, then we should not code them. We should not provide codes for each of the symptoms. We should just code the diagnosis. So we have a final diagnosis that's been provided. We will go ahead and just code that. Okay, so let's get to the next one. And this is the last one I'm going to go through. There are more complicated ones, but I think they would be better suited to their own videos. So that's why I'm not doing it right now. So 1B6 here, 1B6, remember section 1, letter B, number 6. Conditions that are not an integral part of a disease process. Additional signs and symptoms that may not be associated routinely with the disease process should be coded when present. So say you came in with all these conditions and also fainting. And this is not a condition that's integral to the disease. It's not something we normally have associated with COVID-19. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, doesn't mean it's not related. We just don't know that this is a normal part, a normal symptom of COVID-19, okay? So if that is the situation, you came in with all these symptoms, you test positive for COVID-19, and then you also have fainting, you would code the COVID-19 and the fainting. That's what this guideline is telling us. It's telling us you would code one code for the condition that we've confirmed. You would not put any codes for the symptoms that are related to that condition, but you would add a code if it's a symptom that is not normally associated with that condition. Okay, so those are the two things that we're looking at here. And that's what this guideline is referencing. All right, now, like I said, there are more guidelines in here that are really specific and we do want to go over, but I think they'd be better suited to their own video, or at least something we can discuss more in depth in the discussion. But that's all I have for you right now. If you do have questions about this, and I did want to clarify here, please don't take this example as gospel. Like I said, we have a whole bunch of new guidelines just related to COVID-19. I was just using this as an example. I don't want you to take this as, hey, that's how I code COVID-19, because I can't confirm that. I'm just using this as a pretty general example for how you would code symptoms versus that are integral versus not. So please don't take this as my teacher said I can't code loss of smell if I have COVID as a diagnosis. So we need to go through each situation as we go. I think that is the right answer, but I just wanted to use this as a general thing. So please don't take it as gospel. It's just an example. Okay. So if you do have questions or more specific issues you want to go over, that's totally fine. Please post that in the discussion and we can go over that together. Thank you.